Hello, I'm Dr. James Gilley, your instructor for American government. What we're going to be doing this next few modules is doing a bit of a character arc or a story arc, looking at where we get our politics here in America and how we get from the politics once we get our opinions and perspectives and preferences about politics, how that gets enacted into actual usable political activity, right? How do we get from politics to getting our political system set up how we want it to be set up? So let's just go ahead and dive right in. Overshot. So when we're really going to be digging into deeply this week is the question of political culture and political socialization. And before we can really begin to dig into where it comes from, we need to understand what it is we're looking at. Right, so our first big question to address is, what is political culture? Right, this is a bit of a chicken and the egg sort of problem. Right? Political culture is deeply and inherently related to the institutions of politics. But one of the things that we've realized is that it's very difficult to understand, right, which one comes first. Right? Do cultures influence institutions, or are institutions influenced by our cultures? Right, this is a difficult question to kind of parse out, but it's really important for us to understand what political culture is and why political culture is so important. The main importance here, the main reason why we really are going to dig in kind of deep into this idea of political culture is because having a functional and vibrant political culture is very important for democracy to work. A famous political scientist by the name of Robert Putnam has done a lot of work, kind of digging into the importance of political culture, and the creation of what we call a civic culture or a civil culture, And what he shows is that really, making sure that you have a political culture, and a strong political culture with deep ties to it, what he ends up calling civil society, in which we'll deal with that question in a little bit. What he realizes, what we've really observed as political scientists, is that political culture is deeply important, and having a vibrant political society is deeply important for getting society largely to work, for getting a democratic society to work. What we've seen, the way this is, if you've ever been a member of an organization or group of some type, you realize that you have to deal with people with vastly different values, history, just people that are jerks, You have to deal with vastly different sorts of people when you participate in these institutions, In being a part of these institutions, that largely functions to train you how to be a good democratic citizen. So this political culture is really important, Making sure that political culture and having some sort of civil society is really important to the functioning of a democratic system. And because America is one of these constitutional democratic republics, we need to make sure that we have a functional civil society. Now, the question, we've been talking around this, trying to get to an answer, but what really is at its core a political culture? We've been using that term a lot already, but we haven't really defined it yet. So when we're talking about political culture, there's really kind of two different views that we can have here. And we're actually going to look at one much more heavily this week, in this module, and the next module is going to deal much more deeply with the second one, So political culture can be kind of one of two things. It can either be deeply held political attitudes, and that's what we're going to focus in on this week, These kind of deeply held values that we have about the political system. Alternatively, political culture can be viewed as kind of rapidly changing public opinion, So there's really these two schools of thought, On the one hand, the Putnam or Almond and Verba hand, what we're going to be dealing with this week is this notion of political culture as a deeply ingrained set of political values, Values about politics. And what we're going to deal with a little bit more next week is this question of public opinion, right? This rapidly changing opinions about policy. Right? So we're gonna set that one aside for this week and really dig deep into this notion of deeply held attitudes being political culture. But even having this notion that it's deeply held attitudes about politics that define political culture, right? There's still some differences that we can see, right? It can be that political culture is important. Sorry, earbud. It's giving me trouble there for a second. Right? It could be that the political culture that is really important is that of the elites, right? The elites can serve as the gatekeepers of society. They're the ones that really hold and push forward, right, society's institutions, right? So their opinions might matter more, maybe, or the opinion, right, the political culture of the masses, right, you and me and everybody that you know, right, kind of the main body of society, right, most of the people that make up the population, right, maybe their culture matters more because they are in fact selecting the elites who are going to represent them. So right, that's something we need to keep in the back of our heads as we are thinking about political culture this week is, right, whose culture might matter more, right? Is it the elites, right? Do they have this separate political culture, right, from the masses? And which one of those two matters more in this system? Now, within a political culture, there's really three major, right, types of attitudes that you can have about culture, right? Three major categories that your attitudes could fall into, right? They're about your relationship, right, as an individual to the political society around you. The first of these attitudes is called the parochial political culture. What a parochial political culture, per Almond and Verba, who are the political scientists who discovered this or who came up with this understanding of political culture, what they view the parochial nature of political culture as is that you're kind of aware that there's a government. You know that one might exist, but it's far away from you. It doesn't really impact you, right? You can live without being involved in politics in any sort of way because you're not really impacted by politics. This is a very traditional attitude or relationship within a political culture, right? For most of human history, people knew that there was a politics out there, but it didn't really directly affect them. Or when it did directly affect them, right? They knew there was no way they could impact it, so they just kind of went along with their existence. I like to think of this parochial political culture like Pollyanna, right? You've probably heard the term Pollyanna, right? This is actually a character in a movie, right? In books. And Pollyanna lives this lovely life as a little shepherdess out in the Swiss valleys, and she doesn't know anything about the world around her, right? And she just is concerned with her little corner of life. And that's very much what a parochial political culture is like, right? You know that there's this world around you, but you really don't care. You're just concerned about, right, kind of your home place and the way that you fit into that. All right. So the second type of attitude that can be had about political culture is a subject political culture. Right? This is where there are citizens out there, right? And they are aware that politics is a thing that exists. It impacts them on a regular basis. But they know that they cannot change the political system. They can be impacted by it, but they can't change it. So they are a subject to the wills of politics, right? To the whims of the elites and the political system. So parochial, it's out there, who cares? Subject, it's out there and it impacts me, but I can't change it. And then there is what we have, the participant approach to political culture. And that's where, right, not only are citizens aware that there's politics and that politics impacts them, but they themselves can go out and impact the political system, right? So that should be the type of political culture that we see in the United States, because that's the way our institutions are crafted, and our culture and our institutions should reflect each other in some way. So citizens should be aware of politics. They're affected by politics, and they can affect them back. They can influence the government system around them, right? So that is our three basic attitudes about political culture and the political world. So digging a little bit deeper, there's several different levels of political culture, and in each different level, right, we can have different sorts of views about the political system. Got to stay hydrated. Right, the first level that we're going to be dealing with is the system level, right? This could be thought of as either the highest level or the lowest level, right? The base, the foundation upon which politics is built. That's the way I like to approach it. It's kind of this foundational approach. And what the system level does is it really deals with the kind of support that people have for the idea of a nation, right? So this is, do you like America? Right? Do you support the idea of America? Right? In this, we also see some identity things begin to crop up. Right? How you identify as a person, like I am an American, but I am also of Celtic extraction, and I live in Louisiana, and right, all these different things that I identify as. Right? I'm a space nerd. I'm a political science professor. Right? All of these things kind of coalesce, and right, this sort of shows up right at the systemic level of political culture. This is also where we get into ideas of legitimacy. Is the government itself a legitimate system? Right? Is this a legitimate way to govern people? Right? That really comes in at this systemic level. Right? So do we believe in the institutions that we have created? Right? And it's right. It's when these views about legitimacy of the institutions themselves begin to wane. Like I like to think of it like a kind of like a hamster feeder, right? The water thing, they're like a little hamster in its cage, can go up and drink the water out of it. As the level in that thing lowers, right, things get more dangerous and more dangerous. And when you run out of water, right, the hamster can get real mad at you. I've never had a hamster, but that's what I would imagine would happen, right? I know that when the cat, right, I have a cat, and right, when the cat's water feeder sort of thing starts to get low, right, the levels of water in it, right, he can get a little antsy. So the same thing applies, right, at systemic views about how legitimate our system is, right? If fewer and fewer people believe that this system itself is legitimate, right, that's when you can run into severe crises about the actual system. Right? So a lack of legitimacy can actually end up creating major political problems within the system. The next level, right, the next kind of step up is the process level. Right? What this process level is how people actually want politics to be conducted, right? What they expect out of the system. Right, so what government, right? What is the role of the citizen within the system? Kind of like civics class sort of things, right? How democracy should function, how people participate in the system, right? How they do things called, right? How do they try to cause change within the system? We'll get to that a little bit later, right? So this is all about how the system, right? The process of politics itself should play out. Right. And then kind of going one step up from that, right, we end up with the policy level, right? This is what the government should be doing, right? The sort of things that the government should be doing. Should they be intervening within the economy? Is it the role of the government to just be a protector of rights, right? Those sorts of views about like what politics should actually be doing, not just how it should work, but what it should be doing. That is really policy sorts of stuff. What kinds of policies should a government enact, right? This is really where divisions within society start to become massively important. And this is where political parties also start to emerge and play a major role. Now, at all of these levels, there's kind of one big either or decision that's made about politics and views about political culture. And that's this notion of consensual political culture, right? Everyone kind of coming together to work together for the common good, versus a conflictual political culture, which is placing two sides against each other, right? Kind of fighting over what the direction of the system should be, right? This is a very conflictual, right? Conflict-based view of how political culture should function, right? So are you coming together, right, consensually to govern, or are you creating conflict and trying to pull things apart so that your side wins. Right? These are all legitimate ways that the political system can function. Right? But this idea of consensual versus conflictual kind of undergirds the entire political process, right? And thoughts about political culture. So that's going to be really important in understanding how politics gets done. So if there is a latent political culture within society, the question then becomes, where do we as individuals actually get our individual values about politics? And the notion, right, that this concept of where you get your politics, your individual politics from, how politics gets transferred from one generation to the next, is called political socialization. Right? This is very much the same type of process that you would see just about any sort of individual values that get transferred from one generation to the next. Right? If you've taken a sociology class, I'm certain you've seen this notion of socialization crop up before. Maybe the same in anthropology. This is just very much about how the particular ideas of politics get passed from one generation to the next. And there's several different variables that go into this. Right, the way that this can be done, the way socialization can be carried out, kind of falls into two big categories. Right? One is direct socialization. This is where someone directly tells you, right, this is what we value, this is how things should be done, right? This can be a grandparent, this can be a family friend, this could be a civics course, right? Back when you were in high school, I'm sure that you had some coach, because it's always a coach, teach you about what it means to be a good citizen within this system, right? Being directly told about your political values. That is direct political socialization. Whereas indirect socialization occurs when you yourself experience things in the world, right? When world events around you help to shape the views that you have about how politics should be done, right? So direct is someone saying it to you. Indirect is you experiencing, right, the world around you and then forming your views around that. So, when does this happen is also an important consideration. There's really three major views about when political socialization occurs. The first is kind of a traditional view that, right, when we're children and adolescents, about up to the age of 25 or so, that's when we are, right, our brains are still plastic and we're still figuring out the world around us and we're figuring out what we want to believe. And as our brains begin to, kind of solidify and gel by about the time we're 25, right, we pretty much have locked in our political views, right? They've been locked in, but we've developed them over the course of these kind of first two decades or so of our lives, and then by then, locked in. Right? That's kind of a traditional kind of neurosciences view. Right? That's kind of the main way of looking at things. The second view of where and when our politics, right, come in is that, right, we actually kind of change our views over our lifetimes. Right? This is the old Benjamin Franklin adage that, right, a young man who is not liberal has no heart, but an old man who is not a conservative has no brain. Right? That the more that we have in our own personal stakes, like over time, we just become more conservative. There's some evidence towards that, right? There's anecdotal evidence, but there's not a whole lot of really solid right, scientific proof right, of that. Right? So I'm not as big a fan of that second one. The third timing on political socialization is that we, right, kind of develop general views over time, right? Kind of the number one, childhood and adolescence, but as big events, right, big traumatic events can cause a shift in our own views, right? There's a couple of really interesting examples of this. So say a liberal or a fairly progressive sort of person who doesn't believe in guns gets robbed and then goes out and buys a gun for themselves, right? They've had a major shift on that. Or a big public one of these that have occurred before 9/11. There was a kind of a cadre, a handful of really liberal, progressive Hollywood sort of people. 9/11 happens, and then they shift and become conservative. The big example of this is Dennis Miller. You probably know him as a conservative talk radio host, but he used to be a big kind of New York liberal, progressive. He was on Saturday Night Live, and he's kind of underwent a big shift very publicly in his views about politics after a big event, right? Shift him. So these can either be giant world events, or these can be very much personal events that are kind of traumatic, that can change individual views about politics. Now, the way that the way that we become socialized, right? The way that socialization is carried out, right? It can have the effect of either moving people towards unifying, right, being much more consensual, or it can have the impact of dividing us even further, right? Like, oh, us versus them sort of narrative. So socialization, right, just the way that the process is carried out, can also deeply impact the way that socialization occurs, and that has knock-on effects for the way that the system functions. Right, so you can be taught that we all have kind of similar values, right? We're all looking for doing the same things, right? We all want everyone to do better. Or it can be all about, no, our team needs to win, we're right, everyone else is wrong. Very conflict-oriented socialization. And now, of course, there can be subcultures, right, that exist within the overall political culture, right? There can be different pockets of subcultures. And we've actually kind of moved to a bit of a political situation, a bit of a cultural situation where these subcultures kind of make up the majority, right? There's just a whole bunch of different subcultures, a bunch of these cleavages that when they stack on each other, right, give us really the meanings for our own lives. So one thing I would like you to do at this point, maybe pause the video for a minute and think about your first political memory, right? The first time you were really aware of politics impacting your own life, right? Just to share, right, my earliest political memory, the very first political thing I remember was bombing Iraq in 1991. I was a little baby, Dr. Gilly, back then. But I remember seeing, right, on CNN, my parents had it on. I think actually we were at my grandmother's house. And they had CNN on, right? And they were showing the bombing of Baghdad in 1990 or 1991. So that's really the first time I remember politics entering into the discussion. So think about that, right? Think about the first thing you can remember that was politics in your own life. And that's actually going to be one of the questions that you're going to have to respond to. So take a minute and think about that, right? And that's one of the things that's going to be in your assignments. Just giving you a heads up on that. But it's a really important thing to think about how politics has, right, in all of our lives played at least some sort of role, right? I know that there are people out there that really aren't interested in the political system, right? They almost want to shunt themselves into a parochial political culture, right? And that's an entirely rational response to the system. But each and every one of us in some way, right, have been impacted by politics. And even those that want to remove themselves, right, isolate themselves from the politics, that's probably a response to, right, an actual lived experience with politics. So it's important for us to think about our own origins and our own socialization, right? I can't tell you how you were socialized. I can only remember how I was socialized. So I want you to take a minute and think about that. And when you've done that, right, come back and we're going to talk a little bit about how we ourselves received this politics, right? What are the primary agents of socialization? So pause. All right, and we're back. That's always really fun to record something like that. Just to let y'all know, right? So the primary socializing agents of our political system, right? There's really kind of a handful here, about 9 or so major categories of things that help socialize us, that function as agents of political socialization in our lives. The first and most important, pretty much across the board, every culture, is this notion of, right, the family being our primary socializing agent, right? This is really where we get a lot of the socialization in our own lives, right? Think about it, right? Either directly carrying on the politics of our ancestors, right? Some people come from generations of conservatives or generations of progressives, and they're brought into that, and that's what they're going to do. Now in America, we have a little bit more of a rebellious streak in our culture, so we kind of see from generation to generation a bit of a flip-flop. So if your parents were conservative, you're more likely to be progressive. If your parents were progressive, you're more likely to be conservative. But our families play a large role in shaping our worldviews, right? That's very well seen in sociology. That's very well observed in political science. It's a pretty big observation. Obviously, our families, right, the people that we're around when we're growing up, that plays a huge role in how we develop our views about politics. But our families aren't the only thing that play a big role in socializing us, right? We can learn our politics from the social groups that we hang around, right? The identities that we have, that can help transfer and change our views about politics. Right? Some people come from big union families, and right, the union plays a large role in their, right, both their social life and their political views. If you come from a strongly religious family, that can impact, right, your beliefs, right? If you come from any sort of right, if there's something in your life that plays a big role that isn't your family, but you're constantly around it, that can be really important in helping you come up with, right, both your personal identity and your views about the world and politics. So we really can't underestimate, right, the role that our social groups play in, right, helping us form identity, which in turn also helps us form our own political values. We also see that schools themselves can play a large important role. The aforementioned, right, civics teacher, right, the coach that was teaching you about society and politics and how to be a good citizen, right, that's a very direct type of socialization. That can really help socialize us into kind of the systemic level and even process level views about politics, right, about how the system should actually function. Sorry about that. Rogue yawn. Right, so schools themselves can play a direct role in helping socialize us and telling us, right, you're going to be a good citizen, you need to go vote. You need to register to vote and all these things. You need to become educated, right? All the good civics class sort of stuff. That is really what schools are good at doing. We also see that peer groups, right, our friends, can play a big role in helping us develop politics, especially in kind of that late developmental phase, right? The 18 to 23 range, right? Staying up late, talking about, right, what the world should be like, right? Kind of idealized sort of politics, right? That's really important in helping you figure out your worldview and also learning how to defend your views about the political system. I know that played a large role in me becoming Doc G, right, and having my own political views. So that's a really important way of socializing. The interest groups that we're members of or that are around us can be really good at providing us information about the political system, right? Actually giving us, right, ideas about how policy should function. Right? Interest groups on their own are good at this. And so are political parties, right? They're really good at providing kind of information about the system. Media can also play a large role, and media doesn't just have to be the news, right? It's not just about what the news is telling you about the world around you. I always like to give the example of a Kanye West concert. There's usually a 5-10 minute period where Kanye West just goes off and talks about politics in the middle of his concert. Right, I've witnessed it firsthand, right? It's a very political thing. And some people, that's how they get their first interest in politics, is by seeing, right, someone in the media who might not be a typical media member say something about politics, right? Earlier right, kind of in the 1990s, there was a big push, right, by MTV and all of those folks to be much more, right, politically active and politically minded. So the media can play a large role in not only, right, providing information, but also, right, helping us form values within the political system. One of my favorite ones to talk about is direct contact with the government. Uh, this one, it's a pretty important socialization agent. If anyone's ever been to the DMV, right, that can really shape your views about how the political system works, right? Policy sort of things. It gives you that kind of Ron Swanson impulse, like, "Ooh, this is terrible. There's got to be a better way to do it." Or taking that a step higher, if you've ever had to go to a Social Security office, that's just, whew, that's a rough time. I don't recommend ever having to go do that. If you can get away with not having to do it, that's great. But right, that can, right, anytime you're directly interfacing with government, that can really heavily shape your political views. Right, that can play a big role, right? Typically in the negative, but can also be positive. People that were rescued after Hurricane Katrina, right? They probably have a better view, right? Hey, the government came to save us. Or rather, they probably don't, because the government, they abandoned us, right? So very negative views. Right? I know that any sort of direct contact with government is going to leave a big impact on your views and on your life. So right, that's going to be an important thing to consider. And right, finally, as we talked about previously, right, experiencing events in the world can play a huge role in the way that you view the political system, right? The values that you have about politics, just by, right, events in the world, right? If you see Bill Clinton getting impeached, right, that gives you one particular set of views. If you see 9/11, that can impact your worldviews. The election of Obama, the election of Trump, right? These big changes in the world can lead to massively different sorts of political views within the system. So, right, socialization is a really important thing, right? Our politics have to come from somewhere. We aren't born with political views. They have to come from somewhere. These agents, right, listed up there, play a huge role, right? This is like 95 to 99% of things occur because of these particular elements. So if you have any questions about that, please make sure you check in with me. But just having political culture is not enough, right? What we see is that there are particular elements of our politics, right? Just having politics isn't enough, right? It needs to move on and actually become something bigger, right? It needs to become action. So how do we bridge that gap from political culture, right? The fact that we have a culture, over to actual activity within the political system, right? That this is going to be kind of our bridge to our next module. But there's a few things we need to talk about here, right? So the idea of taking everyone's disparate political views within the system and bringing them together, right? That's this notion of interest aggregation. And then once we have our ideas aggregated, we can then take our beliefs about the system and actually articulate them, or say what we want out of this political system, right? That we can be heard within our political system, right? So we have to articulate our interests, right? Using our words and using our actions to show what we want out of the political system. And the way that we do this is through what are called our repertoires of action. So repertoires of action are kind of the menu of activities and ways that we can go about attempting to cause change in a political system. And these repertoires of action can vary from country to country, state to state, right, locality to locality. What is highly effective in one place could be, right, a complete joke in another place. Or what gets the job done somewhere else can be viewed as something completely outside of the political system, like you cannot do that in another place. So the repertoires of action that we have as a society, right, really are dependent upon the political culture that we have. So if you think about the United States, right? If we want to cause political change, right? If we want something different out of the political system in the US, like what are the sort of things that we do, right? What are some low cost sorts of things that we can do, right? Kind of the least, well, not impactful, but the least like personally cost thing I can think of is like retweet something or like something on Facebook, or if you're really feeling extra wanting to make an impact, right? You can actually fire off a tweet storm of your own, but that's still very low cost, right? That's really not doing all that much. Kind of, hiccups, man. I'm having some problems this morning. Sorry. So kind of the next step up that you might have would be, right? So that kind of slacktivism online, like liking, sharing, tweet, subscribe, that whole thing, right? That's about as easy as you can possibly get. Moving up a little bit more costly would be something like writing a letter to the editor, or putting out a yard sign, or putting a bumper sticker on the back of your car, right? You could also, fire off an email to a member of Congress, or if you really want to get important, right? You could call your congressperson. Or even worse, right? You could go and visit your congressperson. And if you don't like what they say, you can vote and kick them out of office. And if that doesn't work, you don't like that acceptance, right? Getting higher and higher, ratcheting up, right? So we're kind of getting pretty high on the things we can do in the United States, right? If democracy isn't working, right, we can protest. And if the protest itself doesn't work, right, the most impactful, most powerful thing you could possibly do in the U.S., right? You could go and riot about something, right? That's very rare. We almost never see that in the U.S., right? It's considered extraordinarily extreme, right? It is not something that we do every day in the United States. So that's about the most impactful, right, high intensity thing we can do in the U.S. Transport ourselves to France, right? Anything lower than voting really isn't going to have that big of an impact, right? So you can ratchet that up, right? They kind of almost immediately go straight to the protest. The riots fairly often, right? Pretty much every summer in Paris, there's some sort of riot or major protest that breaks out into violence in some way. So that's a fairly regular thing in Paris, right? In French political culture. And every now and then they overthrow their government, right? They've gone through several of these big political changes. Right? So that's something that's on the menu in France. And then imagine you're in Syria, right? Where you don't even have the opportunity to vote, right? There's no real way to access your government to show what you want. So pretty much what you're left with there is you start at protest, riot, overthrow the government, terrorist campaigns, right? Civil wars. You have to vote with the bullet as opposed to the ballot. So, right, there are vastly different repertoires of action between, right, political cultures. Right, we in the United States are much more about, right, kind of peaceful democratic norms. Right, about the most crazy thing you might see every now and then is a riot. Protests are still fairly subdued. Typically, voting is about the most extreme thing that we really get going in the U.S. And it's part of our regular thing, right? Every 2 years, we go to a firehouse or a school to overthrow our government, and that's a beautiful thing. Now, we as individuals, right? We as singular people can't really change the political system on our own, not all that readily. So, in order to really accomplish things, right, we join groups, right? We join together to create much, right, more forceful groups. Sorry, the cat TA is getting a little upset out there, but he can wait, right? He on his own is not able to affect much change. He needs to join together. If there are about 4 or 5 cats out there meowing, we'd really have to go do something. So my apologies on the cat TA there. Right, but you have to work together, join groups, in order, right, to be able to impact much more heavily. Individuals really can't accomplish too much. It really takes heavy participation by groups to push forward our democracy, to really cause change within the system. Right. Now, the way that these groups come together, right, it's shaped by the landscape of American political culture. And American political culture is influenced very heavily by its what we call cleavages, right? Which are the fault lines of politics, the breaks within our political society. If you've ever taken geology, right, you talk about cleavages there, right? There are actually places you can go and see, right, within the rocks where there was like a shift, like a break, like a fault. Let's see, like a slip point, right? These also exist within societies, within political cultures. And there are several cleavages that very heavily impact American political culture. Right? One of the biggest, right, kind of overriding notions that exists within our society is this notion of not only manifest destiny, that America, right, has to expand and be a bigger, better country, but then we're also an exception, right? America is, right, there's a large notion of American exceptionalism, that we as a country are different than everyone else. And on the one hand, that's kind of patently absurd, right? We're just a country like every other. But at the same time, if you look at, right, a lot of the metrics out there, if you look at the way that America behaves, the system that we have, we are significantly different than a lot of other countries. Right? So American exceptionalism is something that kind of runs through our culture and throughout our cultural history, right? That America has been different. We have different things that go on here than in a lot of other countries, right? We have more diversity. We have kind of a shorter history. We were founded on Enlightenment liberalism, whereas everyone else kind of adopted that later. So that really heavily runs, right, this notion that America might be different. That really heavily runs through our politics. Right, that's kind of an undergirding feature, right? It kind of runs through everything. But looking at the specific cleavages, right, the break points within our society, the slip points, right, where society breaks, our culture breaks, it really falls into several different kind of divides. Right, there's geography. Geography is massively important in American politics. Right, there's the Sun Belt, right, kind of in the west, the Bible Belt in the south. The Rust Belt in the north, or just strictly north versus south, east versus west, Midwest, flyover country versus the coasts, right? Geography is really important to American politics. Right? Rural versus urban. Do you live in the city? Do you live in the country, right? If you live in the city, you have vastly different problems than if you live in the country, right? So this leads to a big divergence in the political cultures of rural versus urban, right? There's various breaks along racial and ethnic lines, right? So black, white, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islander, right? There's massive breaks along those lines as well. The language you speak at home is massively impactful. It's not as big of a deal in the U.S., but in other countries, right, that's a major political fault line. The religion that you are, or do you have religion or not, that's very, very important. Obviously, your ideology matters, right? Are you generally progressive? Are you generally conservative? Do you think the government should be more interventionist or less interventionist? Right? That's a cleavage, right? The ideology that we have can be a cleavage. Our class, how much money we make, right? Our socioeconomic status, right? The 1% versus the 99%, or the upper quantile versus the lower quantiles, right? These are things that really matter, right? Upper middle class and up, middle class and down, right? These can be big cleavages within society. Gender, sexual orientation can play a big role. Age or generational divides, boomers versus millennials, and then we got the zennials, right? Behind us, the Z-zennials, not the X-zennials. Gen X just kind of hanging out on the sidelines like, whatever, guys, which is the most Gen X thing I can imagine. Right, that's really important, especially in understanding, right, kind of the current political climate. Like I already mentioned, socioeconomic status, right? Do you have a job? Do you not have a job? What do you do? What is your job? How much money do you make? That sort of thing. And there's also a materialist and a post-materialist divide. Are you concerned with things, right? If you're a materialist, are you concerned with like where your next meal is going to come from, economic sort of things? If you're post-materialist, are you concerned more with aesthetics and identity? Right, so there's kind of cleavages based on what the things you're concerned about are as well. So that's going to do it for this module. Right, so we've established our politics, right? What political culture is, where it comes from, and what the rough contours of American political culture look like. When we come back next module, we're going to be looking at how, right, we get from this, right, political views to much more directly political actions. We're going to be looking at how we go about this interest aggregation and interest articulation process. I just wanted to introduce those terms to you right now. So we're going to start looking at how we conduct our political system in the next module. So your task, you've now watched this video. Go ahead, do the readings and take your quiz. And there should be a response paper to do it along the way as well. So be ready to do those. And when we come back next module, right, we're going to be dealing with how do we actually, right, move from the politics that we have to political action. So thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day. Goodbye.